Hello, everybody, and today it's an exciting episode. Welcome back to Untold Evidence. Today we're going into the world of Göbekli Tepe. Now, with this world, there are some incredibly hard names to pronounce, so I'm sorry when I butcher them. But this is the one. This is one of the first ancient structures outside of the Great Pyramids that I ever discovered that just keeps getting more insane, wacky. Every time I watch anything about this, it becomes more and more impossible. I beg you to give me your reading and assertions of it at the end, because sometimes it honestly blows my mind. It's somewhere where I must go before I die because it seems incredible. I know it's held off quite a lot to the public. I will do whatever I can to sneak in, but let's get straight to it. Let me start by giving you a number and let me explain why that number should blow your head off. 11,600 years. Let me start that again. 11,600 years. That's how old the oldest part of Göbekli Tepe is right now. Now, I know that this is an ever-changing number. By the time this episode is released, it could be even longer. Graham Hancock, definitely the man to have a look at here. He works on this reasonably intensely. He gives me a lot of the information that I'm going to talk to you today about. 11,600 years old. Now, to get a feel for that, let's line it up against something that I've already said we know is ancient, the Great Pyramids. That is dated, at least the majority of it, today around 4,500 years old. Stonehenge, about 5,000. So Göbekli Tepe is double the age of all of these. So it means that the Great Stone of the Pyramid we are closer to than the building of this fantastic structure. So this episode is going to be a strange one for the series because the most shocking claim about Göbekli Tepe isn't even fringe. It is now most definitely mainstream. The establishment's position on it is real, and it in itself is a bombshell. And of course, there's people who want to push it even further. Graham Hancock as an example. So we'll walk through it carefully and I'll tell you exactly how solid each piece of evidence is. So firstly, what it actually is. Picture a low hill. Underneath that hill, archaeologists have been uncovering rings of enormous, and I mean enormous, stone pillars. The pillars are T-shaped, like a giant capital T, cut from limestone. The big ones stand at around 5.5 meters tall and all weigh in the region of 10 to 16 tons. These are not small objects in any way. They are arranged in circles with two especially large pillars standing in the centre of each ring and a wall of smaller pillars curving around them. They are not blank. They are carved, covered in animals. This bit of the story is going to get more nuts. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures, scorpions, cranes, spiders. Some carved in flat relief, some standing out from the stone almost in 3 dimensions. And the central T-pillars aren't just pillars, they're figures. If you look closely enough, you see arms running down the sides, hands meeting at the front, belts, even what looks like loincloth carved into the stone. They are styled people, maybe gods. Towering stone beings standing in a ring watching whatever happened in the middle. Just build that image in your head. This is not accidental. This is purposeful and extremely skilled. And here's a thing that should stop you pretty cold. They did it, at least officially, with stone tools, no metal. Not a single iron or bronze chisel anywhere in this world. Metal hadn't even been, quote unquote, invented yet. Let's say discovered, that's probably a better word. They shaped these pillars and they carved that fine animal art using flint, harder stones, antlers and bones. Picture cutting a clean relief of a fox into limestone using a sharpened rock. Now do it to a 5.5 meter tall, 16-ton rock. Then do it again and again for a whole ring. Then build the next ring. And we know roughly how they quarried the pillars because they left one behind, as seems reasonably consistent in ancient culture. They seem to build these enormous stones and leave something behind to show it off. In the bedrock near the site, there's an unfinished pillar still attached to the rock it was being cut off, around 7 meters long. A stone that size would weigh something like 50 tons. So they were carving these giant stones straight out of living limestone, and at least one of them was abandoned mid-job, frozen at the exact moment the work stopped, around 11,000 years ago. That single unfinished stone tells you this was hard, deliberate, skilled quarrying done by hand with rock. This is documented, excavated, dated, and peer-reviewed within archaeology. The man who led the dig from 1995 was a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, working with the German Archaeological Institute. The radiocarbon dating on the oldest enclosures lands around 9,600 BC, and that dating hasn't really changed the entire time. So everything we've just talked about, the hunter-gatherer way of building, the pillars, the carving, that's not speculative, that's accepted, hard-won, mainstream. Now sit with how astonishing that is, because in this world, so few things of this magnitude the mainstream ever accepts. Let me know in the comments if you can think of some other form of alternative explanation that mainstream archaeology would ever accept. They are gatekeepers, sometimes beyond sense. But before we get to why it matters, one more look at the stones themselves, because the detail can be seen as haunting. The most famous ring is known simply as Enclosure D. In the middle stand two of the tallest pillars on the site, well over 5 meters, and they are unmistakably figures. They have long arms carved down their flanks, hands brought round to the front, fingers meeting, and a belt around the waist with what looks like animal skin hanging from it. They face each other across the ring like two giants presiding over whatever took place in between, like guardians or custodians. And around them, the smaller pillars carry their procession of animals, and the choice of creating creatures is striking. So many of them are dangerous: snakes, scorpions, big cats, even vultures. So what was it all for? Well, honestly, I don't think we definitively know, and the careful answer has probably got to be a list of possibilities. So maybe it is a temple in the religious sense. I can definitely see that. Maybe it is a gathering place for ritual and feasting. I also can see that. Maybe something tied into death and the dead, an idea some researchers raise because of the vultures, birds linked in many cultures to sky burial, to the carrying off of the dead. Maybe it's ancestral ventilation, the great T figure standing in the forebears. The truth is we are reading the body language of a religion that is over 11,500 years old, in a language that nobody speaks today. So we can see it mattered enormously, but it's really hard to decide what is actually going on. So I'll let you guys let me know at the end what you think. But let me hammer on why it broke the timeline, because if you don't feel this, the rest of it just won't land the same. For most of the 20th century, archaeology had a clean story about how civilization began. It went a little bit like this. First, people learnt to farm. Farmer give you surplus of food. Surplus of food lets some people stop hunting and start specializing. You then get villages, towns, then leaders, then organized religion, and eventually you get the spare labor and then the organization to build monuments. So the order was farming first, then settlement, then complexity, and then temples. Predominantly always in that order. So the building of monuments often came at the end of these societies and farming at the start. Göbekli Tepe detonates that order, because here is the monumental architecture. Carved megalithic pillars arranged with a clear, and I mean a very clear design, and serious artistry, built by people who had officially not yet started farming. Scientists would say that the grain in the region wasn't domesticated yet. There was no permanent villages of any kind the old model required. So what we're saying here is we have mobile hunter-gatherers that quarried, shaped, carved and transported pillars that are around 10 to 16 tons, Not only that, it was decorated with sophisticated art, and they did it thousands and thousands of years before they planted the first deliberate field. That is definitely not a small adjustment to a timeline. That's a timeline running backwards. How the monument came before farming, and that the single fact has forced a genuine rethink of how and why human civilization had already started, or how it had actually started. So sit with the practical problems, because it's obviously clearly very real. To raise a stone ring like this, you need people, and a lot of them, in one place at one time, doing coordinated heavy work. You clearly need to feed them, you need to house them. You then need someone dedicated to designing it. You need the skilled carvers to carve it, because the animal art is not the work of beginners. And you need all of this from a society that supposedly was still living in small mobile bands following the herds and the seasons. So how do you assemble that workforce with no agriculture to feed them and no settled hierarchy to command them? The honest answer is, we're still working that bit out. The leading idea is that something pulled large numbers together periodically, maybe for feasting, maybe for ritual, maybe for both. There's evidence of huge quantities of animal bones at the site, consistent with big gatherings and large-scale feasting. There are also large limestone vessels, some holding well over 100 litres, and chemical traces of a few of them have been read by some researchers as hints of a fermented drink, an early kind of beer, alcohol. And if that holds up, we've got to picture the scene properly. Not grim forced labour, but something closer to a festival. Crowds drawn in, animals roasted, vessels of some form of fermented drink. And in the middle of it all, the raising of giant, and I mean giant, carved stones. Potentially worship, feast and work, fused into one event maybe. So you get crowds assembling, perhaps seasonally, drawn by something powerful enough to make the effort worthwhile. And during this, things get built. Like, maybe. So let's think about the management underneath that. Someone had to have chosen the site. Someone had to design the rings, because they most certainly aren't random. They all followed a very specific plan. Someone had to organise the quarrying, the dragging of multi-ton stones across the ground, the lifting, and then setting upright without toppling it. Someone had to feed the workers, source the meat, run the whole gathering. That's project management. That's the division of labour. That is most certainly leadership of some kind. And all of it supposedly in a society with no chief, no kings, no written record, and crucially no farms to bankroll any of it. So whatever social glue held this all together, it was extremely strong and sophisticated. It was one of the things we understand the least about the whole event. But notice that this still leaves the deepest question open. What was powerful enough to make scattered hunter-gatherers haul 16-ton stones, carve them with vultures and foxes over and over again for centuries, with no king ordering it and no obvious material payoff? Something organised these people at a scale we didn't think was possible without the very things they didn't have. And this leads to the idea that the lead excavator himself put forward, which in itself is revolutionary, so we've got to give it some room. Klaus Schmidt argued that Göbekli Tepe might flip the whole story of civilization on its head. I probably agree with him. His suggestion roughly was this: maybe the temple came first and the farming followed because of it. Maybe the need to feed all these people gathering at the site again and again over generations is part of what pushed them towards domesticating the wild grain that grew in the fields nearby and on the hills. In other words, perhaps it wasn't farming that gave us religion and monuments. Perhaps it was the desire to gather and worship that gave us farming. Now, personally, unsure, but if I put that into a framework of any other reasoning, I think it's as plausible as anything else. If that's right, and it's serious, it's a published hypothesis from the man who dug the sites, then it means belief built the first temples, and the temples helped build agriculture, and the agriculture built the world we live in. The whole engine of civilization might have started with something in the human mind, a need to come together around a sacred rather than well-built site with a surplus of grains. Now, I do think that is genuinely beautiful and a little bit unsettling. And let's be clear about this. It's a leading interpretation debated among archaeologists, not a closed case. Some researchers think that the farming connection is overstated, but the core fact that it's built on, that the monument predates the farm, well, that is indisputable. It is solid. The debate about what it means, like with most things in ancient culture, is still really hard to pin down. So a detail that deepens the mystery rather than solving it, the site was buried, and it was buried on purpose. At some point, the people who used Göbekli Tepe deliberately backfilled parts of it. They packed the enclosures with rubble and earth and covered them over and over. We have no idea why. It might have been part of their ritual. It might have been them retiring their ritual as a sacred space. It might have been something else entirely. But that deliberate burial is always why it survived in such good condition. They sealed it, and the seal protected it for nearly 10,000 freaking years. The story of how it nearly missed is almost as painful. The hill was actually surveyed back in 1963 by a team that noticed broken limestone slabs poking out the ground. They wrote it off more or less as a medieval cemetery because the idea that a monumental stonework could be that old was just not even on the table. Nobody's mental map of the past had room for it whatsoever. So the most important site of its kind on Earth sat in the soil, catalogued and ignored for almost 30 years. It wasn't until 1994 when Klaus Schmidt looked at it again and recognised what those slabs actually meant. Then he started digging the following year. Now think about that gap. The evidence was literally in hand, written down, and we still didn't see it because it didn't fit with the story that was already believed. That is archaeology, history, and maybe even science in its worst light. It is so silly when our limited thinking as humans completely blocks off an alternative thought process. It's a reason why I started my journey into ancient civilization and untold evidence. We have frameworks, we have paradigms that have got us to an incredible point in human history, but we can't understand how these things were built. And I think our dedication to the formal mainstream view is really holding us back on purpose or accidentally from the real meaning and real technologies these ancient cultures had. Now here's the part where people want to push beyond the mainstream and where we do have to tier it. Because a site this old, this sophisticated and this unexpected is irresistible to the lost civilization argument. The reasoning goes, if hunter-gatherers could do this, then maybe our whole picture of prehistory is wrong, and maybe there was some lost culture, or at least some transmitted knowledge behind it. Here we go with Graham Hancock. You'll hear him say his version, that tying Göbekli Tepe to the idea of an advanced culture wiped out at the end of the last ice age. You'll also hear the geologist Robert Schoch, who argues for even older and more capable ancient societies than the textbook ever allow. Now, these two guys I don't think are idiots. Let me be fair to them and firm at the same time. The instinct behind the argument has a real grain of truth, and Göbekli Tepe itself is proof of that grain. We genuinely did underestimate ancient people. The mainstream had to eat its own assumption when the site came out of the ground. So when someone says, what else have we got wrong? I think that's a perfectly fair question, and this is exhibit A of that. But as ever, there is a difference between we underestimate hunter-gatherers and there is now a lost advanced civilization. The first is now an established fact, the second is not. There's no evidence that Göbekli Tepe, that metal tools were used, or machinery, or even writing, or a technology so advanced that people had lost it. What we see is consistent with skilled Stone Age people doing something extraordinary with stone tools, antlers, muscle and organisation. Astonishing, yes. Beyond human hunter-gatherers, maybe not. So I'll file the Lost Civilization reading as speculative, interesting to chew on, but not supported right now. I would love to do this episode again in a few years and see how close we get to both of these guys' assumptions. As ever with this channel, I do want to follow the evidence, but my gut feeling right now is the evidence is almost certainly going to prove Hancock and Shoup right. I think what they're thinking is almost certainly the right lines. We just don't have the available evidence to rubber stamp it yet. There is one more thing that I do owe you, because it's a good example of how to hold these things. In 2017, two researchers from Edinburgh, led by an engineer named Sweatman, published a paper arguing that the carvings on a single stone at the site, often called the vulture stone, encode astronomical data. Specifically, they read the animal symbols as constellations and argued the stone records were a comet impact around the end of the last ice age, a period that you may have been heard called the Younger Dryas. Now, this is a published, peer-reviewed paper, so it's definitely not nothing. But it was strongly disputed, including by the archaeologists who actually excavated the site, who argued the symbols are being over-interpreted and that you can't reliably read constellations into Stone Age animal art. So where does it actually sit? Credentialed authors, published, but contested and not accepted by the site's own excavation team. Tier that as an interesting disputed claim, enjoy it as a possibility, but we can't treat it as a decoded fact because it just isn't. I do think, and I'll repeat it, this line of thinking is almost certainly worth keeping hold of. I don't think it is ridiculous. I just don't think the evidence has caught up. Whether that's yet or ever, I couldn't wholeheartedly say. But here's the thing that should keep all of us pretty humble. We have barely scratched the surface. Only a fraction of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. The site covers something like 9 hectares. Ground penetration can also estimate that there could be almost 20 other enclosures still buried under that hill, unexcavated and waiting. We are looking at just a slither of it. And it's not alone. In the same region, archaeologists have been uncovering a whole network of related sites of similar age, sometimes grouped under the name, bear with me, Tash Tepealea, the hills of a stone. One of them, Karahandan Tepe, has produced extraordinary findings of its own, including a room carved straight out of bedrock with rows of tall pillars and a striking human head looking in from the wall. So Göbekli Tepe isn't a freak one-off. Hold that right now. It is not it's so freakish by itself, and it's not even one of one. It's one of many. It looks like a part of a whole lost world of monument building hunter-gatherers, most of which is still underground. Let's just think about how freaking nuts that is. The thing that rewrote our entire model of how civilization began is A, only partly dug up and excavated, and B, part of a whole region of similar sites that we're just starting to open up. So when I say that Hancock doesn't have the evidence yet, let us see what else is going on here. Because whatever we think about this period, it's provisional. Because most of the evidence hasn't even been seen yet. The people writing the next generation of textbooks are working with spades right now, and the story is still changing day by day, month by month, year by year. So let me land and tell you where I think I stand, which by now is probably something you can guess. Somewhere in the middle, somewhere a little bit uncertain. There's one more thing with this site that is worth a hearing, and it isn't about engineering at all. It's about what is going on inside these people's heads. To build a temple before you can build a farm, you need an idea worth more to you than a full belly. A belief, a story, a sense of the sacred, strong enough to move stone, gather crowds for centuries, with no obvious payoff you can point to. So Göbekli Tepe isn't only early architecture, it might be the earliest hard evidence we have of a human spiritual imagination running at full power, building something monumental purely because it mattered to them. These were not simple people scraping through the day. They were people carrying deep, organized, demanding beliefs and expressing them in 16-ton stones 11,500 years ago. To me, that should completely change how you picture the inside of a Stone Age mind. Now, I don't know whether a lost civilization built Göbekli Tepe for certain. It's probably human beings. Whether they are part of the lost civilization, we don't know yet. It's probably maybe stone tools, but it is astonishing determination. Thousands of years before we thought they ever could. And I think that on its own, it's one of the most important and humbling facts in all of archaeology. Because we were definitely wrong. Confidently, institutionally wrong for decades about what ancient people were capable of. And it took a hill in Turkey, dismissed for 30 years as a medieval graveyard, to force us to admit this. Although you could argue Mr. Graham Hancock has been doing the same for the last 30 years. So when I ask the question this series keeps asking, can we be sure we've understood the people who came before us? Göbekli Tepe answers it for me. No, we don't have a clue. We have already been proven wrong once, dramatically, and there's a whole region of evidence still sitting unexcavated under the same soil. Now, the lesson here isn't aliens or Atlantis built it. I'm not writing that off. With more evidence, we could definitely form a better argument. But the lesson, at least right now, is a little quieter and more powerful. The deep human past is bigger, older, and richer than the story we were ever told. There are huge missing empty chapters. We are holding one of them in our hands right now, only partly read, and there's still more of them buried. We've got to stay curious, we've got to stay humble, and we've got to keep asking what else is down there. Now, as ever, if I've misrepresented or misunderstood anything, please let me know in the comments. This is one of the most nut stories I've ever come across. I can't wait to go there myself. First brought to me by the great man Graham Hancock himself, I think on one of the Rogan podcasts. When I first saw Graham Hancock, my first hearing of him from memory was a 2012 Maya calendar and him thinking the world was going to get destroyed. Now, he was clearly wrong on that one, but I do not think he's wrong on much. I think he just lacks the evidence. I think he is a fantastic journalist with high integrity. He may be wrong, but at no point do I think he is wrong on purpose to throw us down a rabbit hole like other more formal archaeology may have done, and science for that matter. So I'm really pleased I got this episode out. We will definitely go back to this. I can't cover the wonders of Göbekli Tepe in one episode. We could write 20 on them. And at some point we will do more of this and go down the rabbit hole deeper. The same with the pyramids and Avi Loeb and his expedition and understanding of it. It is really important. As more evidence comes out, of course, I'm going to come back to this. Thank you very much for watching today. As ever, please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. I'm sure I've missed out something very important about this whole topic. If you know it, please link it, give me some data, give me some sources, and I can update this video. For now though, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.